Hi everyone, welcome to Historically Speaking, an online YouTube history channel focused on the history of various institutions and professionals, how history intersects with education and culture. I'm Karen Yang, your host of Historically Speaking, and today we have Dr. Goldie Mohammed, an associate professor of literacy, language, and culture at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She studies Black historical excellence within educational communities with goals of reframing curriculum in instruction today. She's had so many great recognitions, including the 2014 recipient of the National Council of Teachers of English Award, Promising New Research Award, among others. And she has led a federal grant with the United States Department of Education to study culturally and historically responsive literacy in STEM classrooms. She has all this really, really great expertise, including serving as a middle school teacher, a literacy specialist, school district administrator, and school board president. And her great work has been named, has allowed her to be named the top 1% Edu Scholar Public Influencers, which recognizes the 200 university-based scholars who had the biggest influence on educational practice and policy. In other words, this is ultimately the coolest person ever, and I want to be just like you. But thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your bio or
Oh no, that was enough. Thank
yeah, you
you.
just
But I do want to add that
yeah.
it's so nice to meet you and I'm so happy to be with you on this platform together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. With that, I'm just gonna get started.
Yeah.
I guess like as someone who's like interested in both like history and education, I was wondering if you could give me kind of your version or kind of what you know about the history of education and why you personally believe it is something so important and something that we need to look at.
Well, I think history is important across different disciplines, across different realms of life. I
Hmm.
think history as a beautiful metaphor can help to guide us, explain things. History helps us to understand context and what has happened so
Hmm.
that we don't replicate parts of history that can be very hurtful or harmful or problematic. But it's important to understand the triumphs in history and the beautiful parts of history so we can, continue those things. So history can be very telling and just helping to shape our worlds better today. And, as you said, I focus on the history of education, particularly within literacy and more specifically within Black communities in the United States.
Hmm.
And, I feel like when I don't know what to do in education or when I fall like into a space with like, how can we better serve children, communities? I go to history and the genius of our ancestors to help me, to help inform me, to guide me, to provide the roadmap for me and so many others to say, okay, here it is. This is what we need to do. So, that's what studying history does. It helps us to disrupt those harmful practices and structures that do not serve teachers, educators, communities, students well. And it
Hmm.
helps us to go back to those triumphs and successes, the roadmap in which can help children advance to higher levels of elevation, of ascension. And that is the goal. So history can
Hmm.
be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I really like this idea of we can kind of learn a lot of lessons from history. History is also kind of an educator or rather like a teacher as well.
Sure,
Definitely like looking in the past of what we should versus what we shouldn't do, which is super, super important.
sure.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, I wanted to ask, what are some lessons you think that we can take from history to kind of re-examine or rebuild or even just build from scratch the school system or education system we have today? And how do you think that we as students and teachers can kind of keep these lessons in mind when we're learning, I guess?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Karen. And we cannot start with the history of education. We have to start with the history of the society of the United States, of all these wider realms.
Mm-hmm.
Education is sort of like one facet in it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I start with the history within society in a wider space, because typically, if schools need help, society needs help.
Yeah,
Schools are
that's a great
reflections of
one.
society, right? And if the laws are hurtful or harmful to people,
Mm-hmm.
then we're going to see if practices, if norms, whatever you call, name it. If we
Mm-hmm.
see these problems in society, guess what? They're going to come into our schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're thinking about schools, we have to understand. I mean, I just think it's interesting intellectually when you take on a job and a profession within education, you have to know the inception. How
Mm-hmm.
did we get here? I can't just show up in a classroom and teach. I need to know the history of a space, the history of education. What was the first school? What did it look like? What did the curriculum look like? What did it look like in decades to come after? Because if
Mm-hmm.
I know that, I should know what has been very, problematic and what has been very successful.
Mm-hmm.
Without
Mm-hmm.
studying history, we can take anything that they give us in schools, policy, curriculum, mandates, whatever it is, and say, oh, okay, let me teach this.
Mm-hmm.
History teaches us to question stuff, to
Mm-hmm.
say, to make comparisons. It helps us to be critical thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I study education, I look at our curriculum system and our system of education. I'm like, well, that's what we were doing back in the 1600s. But if I don't know what happened in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1920s, I mean, you can go on and on. How
Mm-hmm.
do I know if this is the best thing to do today? You know
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying? So, history helps me to look at all sorts of practices, both the triumphs and the problems.
Mm-hmm.
And to see where are we today? Where were we then? Have we really made progress? In which ways have we made progress? Which ways haven't we made progress? And it helps me to navigate and move better for the
Mm-hmm.
sake of my students and children and teachers who I work with. So,
Mm-hmm.
we must understand our system and not just from a Eurocentric perspective.
For
See, when I
sure.
was taught the history of education, I was taught about all old white men and white women. Even I had a children's literature class in
Mm-hmm.
grad school. And, the first couple of classes was like the history of children's literature. Every class I take, it would start us with the history of writing, the history of this. And it was almost like indigenous and people of color and Black folks, we just didn't exist in this history, in this
Mm-hmm.
version of a history. And so, we have to understand and question
Mm-hmm.
and tell the completeness of history, not just the white children's literature, but the
Yeah,
other children platforms of children's book writers and things like that. Because if I don't see myself in this history, how can I, move about schools today?
for sure. It's kind of like if you don't even see yourself in the news, how can you believe that one day, you know, I can go to the moon or you can go to the moon if I don't see someone who looks like me trying to
Yeah.
do that?
Representation is important because it speaks to possibility. And I
Mm-hmm.
think people who always see themselves or didn't even have to think about that, see, they've never had to think about possibilities in the ways in which we may have.
Mm-hmm.
And so representation is more than just seeing yourself as speaking to, it's like enacting, and its action is moving toward possibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For sure. I think that you definitely addressed a lot of really, really great stuff in your response. Like, so I'll try to like digest it a little bit, which is super, super cool. But I think I really liked how you talked about how you needed to know kind of the history of the space. It's also kind of like listening or learning how your students learn or how your students kind of like the history of your students or how your students have reacted or what experiences they've gone through to make
Yeah.
these to make these lessons, I guess, more approachable or just make more sense to them as well, which I think is super cool.
Yeah, it's like how I say we cannot teach who or what we don't know. If we
Mm,
don't know the land, if we don't know the community, you can walk into any school and you wonder, like, what is this vibe like? Why are people acting this way? History helps to explain that. It could
mm-hmm,
be the history of how teachers were treated. It could be the history of, some schools have like civil rights and human rights histories. And, great, history around humanizing practices, it helps to really explain things. But,
Mm-hmm.
if we go into these spaces and just like be
Mm-hmm.
without like, we should be informed of this history. That will help us to be and to teach and lead better. When we know
Mm-hmm.
the history of a space, we know the history of students, we know who they are,
Mm-hmm.
and who are their people? Who do they come from? That's
Yeah.
going to help any educator be better,
Mm-hmm.
to put it in real simple terms.
Yeah, I think so often I think of like politics and how politics is kind of like a metaphor for so many different things in life. It's also kind of like, oh, if I vote for this representative, I want to make sure that they truly understand who I am and, my values. And so much of that, again, as you said, kind of comes from our history or the history of our people and, the issues that have affected us in the past and the values that we hold. So I think that it's all kind of very much interconnected for sure.
Yeah, it is.
I wanted to ask, I think we've touched on this idea of kind of the problematic side of history. And, the history of education is filled with just like inequity and inequalities. And I think that I wanted to ask, how do you feel like we can kind of grapple with some of these inequities or inequalities that we found or have seen in the history of education?
We have to name them, first and understand them. Some people
Mm-hmm.
don't even want to name them. Someone asked me over the weekend, is there a better word for anti-racism? And I said, what is the problem with saying anti-racism? Do you think racism is a bad thing? Okay, well, anti is against it. Now, if you don't think racism is a bad thing, you might have a problem saying that. It might make you uncomfortable. But
Mm-hmm.
imagine what it's like feeling racism being projected upon you on a daily or regular basis. And you
Mm-hmm.
just don't want to say the word. Imagine experiencing it. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so the first step is naming, understanding, recognizing it, studying it. So many people now are talking about different things in education, have never read a book on it. They've never taught a lesson plan, have never written curriculum, and you're talking about what children should learn. How is that possible? You don't even know
Mm-hmm.
what it's like to write it and to teach it.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be the first step. And then we have to name the problems. Like, we have a basic education system. That's why most children in the United States are at basic proficiency levels, because we
Mm-hmm.
have never been at an advanced or accelerated level of education. We have
Mm-hmm.
never had standards or pursuits that will elevate students higher in their mind, their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have to understand things. We have to name the problems. And then we have to understand the history of education and name the problems that we had and ask ourselves, are we still reproducing, replicating the same problems and issues today? Why haven't we changed? And I'll give you an example of this, Karen. In the 1600s onward, we really had state standards. We
Mm-hmm.
had we didn't have state standards like in the 1600s, but we had some standards. They weren't called state standards, but we had
Mm-hmm.
standards, we had assessments, we had teaching and learning practices, we had teacher evaluations that were all under Eurocentric practices of teaching skills only, skills that were decontextualized and isolated from students' lives and the world around them. But
Mm-hmm.
when you study communities of color, like Black communities, you find the complete opposite. But the Eurocentric practices have governed and mandated our state of education. Like
Mm-hmm.
skills only instruction, where you're teaching students how to engage in a skill, but they don't know how to apply the skill to the world around them or what that skill has to do with their lives. That's so basic.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Mm-hmm.
that's not good for anybody, but it's
Mm-hmm.
worse for students who don't have certain opportunities that other people have in the United States and in the world. So,
Mm-hmm.
this is what I mean. We need to name these things, understand history, and we need to start breaking down and tearing down those structures. That's why a lot of people don't like the word, how do we restore education? And a lot of people like, how do we dismantle these parts and rebuild? And
Mm-hmm.
we have the blueprint. Folks just don't want to do it because they're benefiting somehow, or their children are benefiting somehow, and other children are not. And they do
Mm-hmm.
not want every child to succeed. I don't care what they say, they don't. Because if they did, we would have different legislation around education in this country if we saw all children as our children.
Mm-hmm. That's like I think something that, I think, oh my God, I'm just still processing again. But I think this kind of even goes back to what you were talking about in the first question with the idea of that, like, oh, we need to first look at our culture and look at our society. I feel like this kind of issue of like, oh, it's us versus them, I either succeed and they don't, or they succeed or I don't, like this kind of very divisive mindset definitely comes through from our own society and like our own culture and like what's going on there. So I think like as you said, I also really like the idea that people are choosing to very be conscious of their vocabulary that they're using when they talk about the education structure of whether they want to restore it or want to dismantle and rebuild. I think that's like such an interesting idea, and I think that as a young person, I feel like kind of in the education system, it's probably not until I get 2 or 3 years out of the public school education system that I'm really able to see, oh, here's where there were some of those issues that I personally would have really liked to see changed, or oh, that didn't benefit my peers or something like that. So I think it's
Yeah,
all
we
just
notice it once we're out of it.
yeah.
I mean, I'm sure fish would notice, water more if they're out of that too, if they're,
Mm-hmm.
it's just in the air. Yeah, we notice it and we can call it out when we have a different vantage point, a different perspective. But if
Mm-hmm.
everything like this has been so normalized and you
Mm-hmm.
just think like this is just how education is, it was
Mm-hmm.
always like this,
Mm-hmm.
you don't really question it unless, you're very special and someone teaches you or you're pushed to question something that doesn't feel right for all people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then maybe it's like in part also we need to ensure that we install more of those values, or re-examine kind of what is going on in our own culture that allows us or doesn't allow us to see those things for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to be more
Um,
human in how we move about. I mean, because all of this comes down to one thing: humanity and love. That's at the center of all this work. And if
mhm,
we have it, we start to provide opportunities,
mhm,
reparations,
mhm,
educationally, right? And all sorts of things that we have just not provided for many of our children, our babies, in this country. When we
mhm,
have that humanity perspective, we have a different orientation for the work.
mhm, for sure. I guess I wanted to ask, how do you feel that we need to change the way I guess we educate, or what does I guess the idea of like dismantling and rebuilding look like to you, or look like in the past, or you feel like you've heard about that you're like, hey, that's something that I feel like we should all be doing right now.
Well, I mean, you got to keep in mind the more we have laws and policies against racism, discrimination, um,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because we see people being hurt in our world. The more
Mm-hmm.
we have that in society, the better situated we are for schools.
Mm-hmm.
But there are lots of things that we need to change. If we just go from looking at, what I call culturally and historically responsive education and teach more than just skills, right? We need those policies against anti-racism. We need to change, teacher education and who prepares to be a teacher and
Mm-hmm.
how teachers teach. We need to prepare how long they teach and how much is put on them. I mean, there's so much. I have a whole plan. But if I
Yeah.
can give you one part of curriculum, we need to teach 5 major pursuits of learning. We need to teach identity development in our schools, skills,
Mm-hmm.
intellectualism, criticality, which is the social justice thread, helping our young people to name, understand, and disrupt hurt, pain, and harm in the world. And we need to teach joy. We need to make joy just as prominent as skills and identity.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we only teach one: skills. And
Mm-hmm.
are skills enough? I mean, you're a young person and you can say, do you need only skills in this world? Or do you also need to know
Mm-hmm.
who you are and know about the lives of others and know how to love yourself and others? Do you also need intellectualism? Do you also need consciousness and criticality and learn how to make the world a better place? And do you need joy? Of course, you need
Mm.
all five of those.
Mm-hmm.
Skills was never enough. Even if we changed our system of what we choose to focus on, teach, and assess, we would see
Mm-hmm.
a different educational system. Just with that one part.
Mm-hmm. I think when you were talking about, oh my gosh, we kind of need to like really take a hard look at like every single level of, what's going on in education. It kind of reminded me of like how often teachers are so overworked and, like the hours, the long hours and the sheer amount of students that they have to take care of. That definitely hampers like the educational experience and also just leads to like a nuanced or like a very different experience. And I think that's definitely something that we should be looking at and thinking about. But I also really like how, it's kind of like a really meta idea to be learning about how to learn or learning about why we should learn. But I think it's nonetheless very important. And I feel like even among my peers, it would make us a lot more motivated to go back into that one more problem set and really try to reconvene why we need to do this and why we need to learn this and the importance of doing that, not just purely learning it just to pass a test or something like that.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're doing. We're teaching to pass a test and get into college. What happens in life after those two things? We want people
Yeah.
to not inflict hurt and pain on themselves or others. It has to be something more important than skills and taking a test.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're looking around and we're watching the news. There's stuff happening. Skills are not enough. Stuff is happening. Very skillful people are doing very hurtful things.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not enough for everybody. And I don't think it ever has been enough. This is
Mm-hmm.
why I'm pushing more of a better pedagogy, a teaching and learning practices and philosophies and foundations in schools.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Um, as we wrap up today, is there anything else you'd like to impart? Any links or anything you'd like to have everyone visit or something like that?
Well, I just finished my next book.
So
So
exciting.
that's sort of the thing that's prominent and on my mind because I'm just happy to have it complete. When you work on something so special and a big project, once you get to that point, you're like, wow, this is incredible. So it's
Yeah.
actually a book on joy in education and how to implement culturally and historically responsive education in those five pursuits I named.
Mhm.
It's called Unearthing Joy. And each chapter is a joyful experience with layered playlists of songs, art,
Oh my God,
poetry, coloring.
this is so
Um,
cool.
an artist, Pharrell Williams, wrote the foreword, and most people know him as in his artistry in the world, and he is incredible. And yeah, so it's a guide not just for teachers, but community people, educators, students, university personnel, anyone who has an interest and a stake in education and joy, I think would really benefit from the book. So I'm
Oh my
excited
gosh.
about it, and I hope others will be too.
I'll make sure to check this out and I'll link everything down below. But wow, I think that's so interesting. Just like the joy, I can't wait like to check out the playlist and the art. Oh my God, that is so cool. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have joy. Like that's what I want for everybody. I want them to have a sustained happiness and have joy.
Mhm.
I want that for our educators. I just want it for everyone, and so that was the intention of the book.
That sounds super cool. But
Yes.
I'm gonna just wrap up today. Thank you so much for joining me today about talking about such a wonderful and such an important topic as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. It's been a joy to meet you and be in your space.
Yes. And to everyone watching back at home, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.